violence area of responsibility. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar where we are going to hear from 5 experts on monitoring, evaluation, and learning for the purposes of advocacy, which is a topic that's obviously hugely interesting to myself and clearly interesting to members of the protection world, given the number of colleagues who have joined an August webinar. So we thank you for being here. Just a few logistical notes. First, as Yasmin explained, this webinar does have simultaneous interpretation between English and French. We ask that when you do come off mute and participate, that you speak slowly and clearly to show respect for the interpreters and their work. And as Yasmin explained, if you are trying to listen to the interpreters, please use the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. We also ask that folks stay on mute when you're not speaking. And as you hopefully saw, this webinar is being recorded. Okay, now to the substance. As I was preparing for the webinar, I was trying to think of the kind of similarities and relationship between monitoring, evaluation, and learning, MEAL, and advocacy. And within the IRC, we actually call both of those teams enabling functions for our humanitarian work. We consider both MEAL and advocacy to help create the foundations for which humanitarians themselves can operate through quality evidence-based programming with the necessary support from others, such as donors. We both use iterative processes, and we both believe that learning is critical to success. But we often have trouble bringing these two areas of expertise together and applying MEAL's critical work to the advocacy work that a lot of us engage in. And when many of us think of MEAL, I think we think of log frames and outputs that can be reported to donors. But a lot of really good and impactful advocacy is actually not particularly visible, maybe not that output oriented. Advocacy is opportunistic, it's long-term, and often what actually makes the most impact on the decisions of decision makers doesn't fit super well within the commonly used tools for MEAL. So what tools should we be using for advocacy that can actually capture impact? And how can we make MEAL for advocacy something that goes beyond the reports to donors? How can we use MEAL for advocacy that improves advocacy in the same way that we utilize MEAL to improve other types of humanitarian efforts? In a few minutes, we're going to turn to those 5 experts to share their tools and experiences to try to answer some of those questions. But we really want this webinar to be a group of peers that come together to share tools and successes as well as challenges. And so we're going to start with some questions for yourselves that we hope you will be able to participate in through a Zoom poll. And we'll have our colleague Yasmin share the Zoom poll. Is that coming up? Thanks, Yasmin. It's just come up for me. Where we're just interested in hearing from you if you use MEAL tools when you're conducting protection advocacy, and if you actually think that the tools you're using are suitable for that advocacy. So we'll ask that you submit your answers. Oops. Sorry. I don't know how long I was muted. I don't know if others are seeing the results of the poll, but I don't see it just yet. Not yet. Thanks, Amy. Thanks for being a participant. Well, while we sort that out, and we can come back, I think, to the results, I will actually introduce our first speaker, one of those experts that I teased earlier. We're going to start with Claire Thomas, who is the co-executive director. Oh, there we go. Sorry, Claire. We'll get to you in a second. Just to reflect, most people actually say that they only sometimes use meal tools for conducting advocacy, and many of us are unsure if they're suitable for our protection advocacy efforts. So I'm really glad that we're all here today in order to get some more support so that we can kind of turn these into all yeses. And the first person that we will hear from in order to try to do that is Claire Thomas, who is the co-executive director of Minority Rights Group International. Claire's portion will hopefully start with a video, and then we'll go straight into your presentation, Claire.
Hi, hi, lovely to meet you all. It's not me who has the video, that you have to wait for that, so hold your breath. But what I am going to do, I hope, is share my screen and share, hopefully this is going to work. You will be able to see a PowerPoint, which you will see as a, can everyone see the PowerPoint?
We do see it, and we see it as a PowerPoint.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I've worked for MRG for 2 decades and more, and a Minority Rights Group is an organization that does advocacy for ethnic, religious, linguistic minorities and indigenous peoples. So we have been trying to work out how to evaluate advocacy for that length of time. We don't have all the answers, but I'm going to share with you some ways of kind of framing the question that might help with the later discussions, I hope. So we just wanted to get out of the way that when we're talking about advocacy, we're talking about influencing policy, ultimately to influence practice, but initially we're talking about influencing policy. We're assuming that you're all operating on a human rights-based approach. So you're working towards the fulfillment of rights for rights holders by duty bearers. So a duty bearer in many development settings would be a government, a minister, a ministry, an agency of a government. But in a humanitarian setting, it can be a UN entity or a non-governmental actor. So we need to think a little bit wider, perhaps, than we might be used to. So in essence, what is monitoring, evaluation, accountability and learning? It's all about, did something change because of what you did? And hopefully, were the lives of right holders improved in some way as a result? So, I mean, this is really important in terms of assessing impact or capturing impact. You need to try to understand what has changed. You need to understand what caused that change, or at least whether something you did contributed to that change. And ultimately, you want to understand if that flowed down into changes for rights holders. So what is special about MEL and advocacy? So traditionally, what evaluators like to do is to set out the change they want to achieve very specifically. Often they'll use a theory of change. They may use a log frame that's been talked about, results matrix. But the point is that they know exactly what they're trying to change when they start out on their journey. And this is based on an understanding that the context is predictable, that you can say what is likely to happen in the next few months or the next few years in a given context, with or without the input that might lead to the change that's being described as desirable. and that change can result from a single input, that you can do one thing and that will bring about change in and of itself. And this is exactly what randomized controlled trials are all about, trying to get the causality of one change down to one specific factor or input. Now, for protection advocacy meal, while having those things being true is not impossible, it's pretty rare. And if you rely on the kind of approach that says, I have a roadmap and I'm following my roadmap. I have a starting point on the left of the diagram, which is often a baseline in our context. I have an endpoint, which is where I'm trying to go, which is a result or an impact. And I kind of have a rough idea about how I'm going to get there
de
and what
comment
I'm going to pass
parvenir
along the way.
au
So if you
point
look
B
at my
et les
pasted
obstacles que
throat
vous avez
goat
rencontrés
image, you can see that
au
there's a
fil
camp,
du
a
processus.
little
Par
tent
exemple, ici, vous voyez
on
une
the
petite
left, and
tente,
then
un
some
campement,
mountains on the left, and
et
then there's
quelques
a
montagnes à
signpost,
gauche, vous avez un
and then there's a
panneau,
lake on the right.
vous
And
avez un
what
lac
evaluators
à
love to
droite.
do is say, yes, we're going
Les
in the right direction
évaluateurs
from
aiment
A
se
to
dire
B
oui, nous sommes sur la bonne
because we
voie
can see all
pour arriver
these
à
things we're
destination B
passing
car nous
along the way.
passons.
The problem with this approach is that it focuses your mind and attention pretty much exclusively on the route you're intending to take. And if your route is very unpredictable and you might have to backtrack, or you might have to go sideways for a while, or something might just appear in your path that wasn't there before, then this approach doesn't really work for you. Not only that, but there may be impacts of what you're doing, or results or effects or consequences of what you're doing. And because you're measuring only certain predetermined things that you've decided at the outset, potentially you're not even noticing some of the things that are happening as a result of what you're doing. So if you're doing MEL for protection advocacy, what you want to do is forget the map, forget the A to B journey, forget baselines, forget, if you can, log frames and results matrix, and come to your MEL with a very different perspective. And what I want to encourage you to do is see your impact much more like somebody standing beside a pond, and you're going to drop a pebble or a rock into that pond. Now that will create a ripple, and the ripple will move out in all directions in a circle from where you dropped the rock. And as it does that, it may create, for example, a wave that goes up onto that rock on the right side. It may move a piece of that reed you can see. It may make it sway as the ripple hits it. There are some things floating on the water, and they will rise as the ripple goes under them, and then they will fall again. So what you want to do is have a 360-degree view of what is happening as a result of the inputs that you are putting into the system. And instead of saying, I want to create a wash on the rock, I'm only going to look at the rock because that's what I'm focused on. You look at everything, which is the result of what you're doing. Now, the reason you need to do this is where it becomes really complicated, because the right analogy for the situations that we are all operating in is not actually a very nice still pond with a nice green forest around it. The reality of the context you're operating in is much, much closer to this piece of water, which is a mountain river. And you can imagine if you drop a pebble in this piece of water, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult for you to ascertain what the impact has been. And this is a much more kind of realistic policy advocacy. There will be multiple actors. So there'll be multiple people potentially dropping pebbles in ponds, multiple sets of ripples, all of which will interlock with each other. and the water might be quite turbulent, and the water might be quite cloudy. And we'll come back to that. So if you're in discussions with your MEL colleagues or with your donors, and they're saying, you can just do the normal thing, you can get out this PowerPoint, which we'll hopefully put on the website, you can show them these slides and try to convince them that this is not always the case. So what do you need to deal with? We've talked about complexity and unpredictability, but I'm just going to talk about a couple of other things. So when you're trying to influence policy, you're essentially influencing politicians and potentially diplomats. In English, we have a saying that says a diplomat is someone who's sent abroad to lie for his country. Politicians classically are not always known for telling the truth. And in particular, they don't tell the truth about why they change their policies. Even if they do decide to change their policies as a result of something you did, they will almost always claim it was their idea and not your idea. So it becomes very untransparent indeed. And this is very problematic in terms of showing causality of how your input resulted in change. You also have an issue around whether policy change has transferred into real benefits on the ground, and who decided what was the change that was being sought, and who decided whether it actually did make a change to their lives or not. So participation is hugely important, but it is just another added layer of difficulty, to be honest. And then we have donor requirements. So donors do have requirements, but particularly in the area of advocacy, donors might be more flexible than you realize. And it's really a question of pushing quite hard. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So what can you do? Have a 360-degree view of the changes. Don't measure only what you think you might want to happen. Measure everything that you can perceive is changing as a result of what you're doing. And you can find clever ways to build this into log frames. So you have very general advocacy objectives or indicators that talk about instances in which you can see a result of without necessarily determining exactly what result you're heading for. We do that a lot. You have a real problem with baselines. Any log frame that requires a baseline will not allow you to change what you're measuring as you go along. Because if you get to year 3 of a project and you decide to measure something else, you don't have a baseline for it. You can signal this to your donors at the very outset. You can explain the problem. They may well be flexible. Log frames are supposed to be living documents. Good luck and let us know how you get on. There are tools out there. So outcome mapping is a great tool. It's very, very developed. It's past 20 years of life now. They've celebrated the 20th anniversary. A linked thing is outcome harvesting. There's things like most significant change. There are a lot of tools out there that are more suitable for MEL of protection advocacy. And then just be really realistic about your causality. So you're never going to claim, when you're doing advocacy, you never bring about the result. You always influence someone to bring about the result. So you can never claim to have single-handedly achieved anything. You always needed the policymaker, the decision maker, the duty bearer to decide to make the change. And we all know that because quite often they don't. So your causality best case is that our intervention was necessary, but not sufficient to bring about change. I have a little anecdote I tell, which is that historically, we once drafted a piece of legislation in a consortium with a number of other actors. It so happened that when we published it, there were some typos in it. They weren't obvious typos. The government we were seeking to influence published a law. Sections of their law had our typos in it. So we knew that they had cut and pasted, copied across from our draft text we were advocating for into their draft law. Tragically, the law never became law. There was a change of government and it never became law. But it's worth thinking about if you're trying to influence policy and you're working on policy texts, to see if you can hide markers in your text, because then you can claim that at least somebody did use what you sent them. So there's lots of stuff out there on the net that you can use. I've picked this outcome mapping learning community. You've got the link there. There's a huge amount of material. It's quite developed, and you don't be put off by the fact that it's got a whole terminology, it's got a whole language they've developed. That's why I put light in the previous slide. You can apply some of the principles of outcome mapping, which it does what it says, which is it maps outcomes. But it's they put a lot of thought into the process, and it gives you lots of ways of trying to identify who you're influencing and how you've influenced them. And I put the second slide. This is one I found just recently on that site, the picture on the right. And it's to show you that donors are interested. This is USAID. I know FCDO has used outcome mapping itself to try to evaluate its own policy influencing. So they are beginning to understand in terms of their own practice, but also in terms of when they're funding others to do work, that these kind of approaches are useful. So you can have a conversation with your MEL colleagues about trying to include these kind of approaches when you're explaining to donors what you might like to do. So I'm going to leave it there. Good luck, be bold, be creative. I'm sure other speakers will go into more concrete examples, but hopefully I've begun to sort of set the scene in terms of the direction you might want to think about heading. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Claire. I really appreciated maybe particularly the sneaky meal anecdote that you shared. Hide markers in the text, not something that I had considered before, but I like any sort of sneakiness, so that's excellent. Yasmin is going to share another poll. Is that true, Yasmin? And she's actually been sharing, if you're not monitoring the chat, she has actually been sharing a lot of the resources that were mentioned there. So please do make sure that you check those out and spend a little time on the chat. And I'm just going to make sure that that poll is coming up for everyone. We're still seeing the previous poll. And we can also do it at another time in the session if it's not coming up. There we go.
It worked.
So we do have another, thanks, Yasmin. We have another poll for folks, which I'll give you a couple of seconds here to answer, where we're asking you to reflect on the key challenges that you're facing in capturing the impacts of advocacy. And while you reflect on that, I'll just reflect on some of what Claire actually said to us. And just thanks very much for setting the stage for us and getting us to think about the foundational questions and challenges of Meal for Advocacy. I loved your metaphors. I'm going to ask for your mountain visual specifically afterwards, because I think it so clearly helped me explain, or it will help me explain something that I try to explain to a lot of people about advocacy all the time. And I think the thing that I might be taking away the most from your presentation, Claire, is the need to kind of strategically unlearn, have maybe useful forgetfulness about some of what we know and use about meal. So thanks very much for that. And then also making sure that we recognize that there are a lot of tools out there in order for us to actually do Meal for Advocacy. I hope folks have had time to answer the poll, and maybe we can put up the results. Thanks so much. So it looks like the majority of us really have difficulty knowing kind of what contributed to change, which I think is a lot about what Claire has really talked about. And then the lack of resources that people feel, which is great too, because you now have resources right in the chat to hopefully be able to look towards. Um, we actually are going to go over to Pauline Kubire now, who is the Strategic Partnership and Advocacy Advisor for Women's International Peace Center, WIPSI, which is a tremendous women's rights organization that I have actually had the pleasure of working with in the past. So I'm very excited that you will all hear from Pauline in this space. Pauline will be speaking on their advocacy efforts, particularly as women's rights and protection actors. So over to you, Pauline.
Thank you so much, Helena, and thank you so much for speaking about the Peace Center like that. It's an honor to gather here with so many passionate advocates for women's rights and protection within the women, peace and security agenda. So like Claire mentioned, I work for Women's International Peace Center, which is a feminist organization, and our work is to ignite women's leadership, amplify their voices, and deepen their activism in recreating peace. And our advocacy is usually around claiming spaces for women to participate in peace processes at all levels. So I'm happy that we are having this conversation because for us, from a feminist perspective, advocacy is not just about influencing policies, but also challenging the power structures under which these injustices happen. And our role is to amplify the voices and experiences of women in these settings, particularly those who are most marginalized. So when we talk about effectively tracking and capturing the impacts of our advocacy, it's important that we are not only looking at results, for example, in policy change, but also how power has shifted, especially from those who perpetuate the violence and exclusion to those who are seeking peace, justice, and equality. And like Claire alluded, that our advocacy results in transformation in their lived experiences for women on the ground. So for example, looking at protection advocacy and aiming to ensure that women and girls are protected from all forms of violence, especially in conflict and humanitarian settings. But from a feminist perspective and the work that we do as an organization, protection is not just about preventing harm, but transforming really the conditions that lead to violence against women, whether it's changing laws, influencing policies, or shifting attitudes at the community level or in society. So when we are capturing outcomes or impact, some of the questions we ask are our efforts leading to stronger protection for women? Are women and girls safer? Are they more empowered? Are they more able to assert their rights? So for us as an organization, it's also important to capture these outcomes because it allows us to document the change that we are driving through our advocacy. And when we document this, we are able to, first of all, hold ourselves accountable beyond donors to the women and girls that we aim to protect. But also, this documentation helps us to learn from our experiences and also adapt our strategies. Because in our context, the needs are often complex or sometimes evolving, especially in active conflict. For example, with the work that we are doing in the Democratic Republic of Congo or Sudan, We need to understand what worked well, what didn't, and how we can improve our future advocacy efforts to make them more effective and targeted. But also documentation helps us to build a body of evidence that can be used to support our future advocacy. So we do this by doing research from a feminist perspective, and this means that we are looking beyond what's on the surface, but trying to document and get experiences on the ground informed by feminist principles. So beyond looking at logical frameworks also that Claire alluded to, what needs to be tracked or what we sometimes track in our work is efforts that lead to the concrete improvements in the lives of women and girls, especially on the issue of peace processes and for women in conflict-affected areas, that are they being heard and respected and recognized as agents of change. We know that there are existing tools, some of which Claire mentioned, but for us, it's important that feminist principles are integrated in these tools, or we also provide for options where we can create feminist tools which not only measure the immediate outcome of our advocacy. For example, when we engage with policymakers and a law is passed, but also seek to address the deeper systemic changes that we see. So sometimes it's difficult to measure some of the changes that we are working towards, especially with the traditional monitoring and evaluation tools, which tend to focus on results that are quantifiable. So even in this call, I'll say that we need M&E tools that are explicitly feminist, that are measuring shifts in power dynamics, that are measuring changes in gender relations, and the extent to which women are recognized as leaders, for example, in peace and security processes. So, for example, a feminist male framework that we are trying to adapt to is one that not just tracks the number of women participating in peace negotiations, but the level of influence that they wield in those spaces, whether it's the fact that their priorities are taken up by the decision makers, and if these are reflected in the final agreements, but also understanding the quality and depth of their participation and leadership. So we also involve our constituents. As a peace center, we work with women and girls and some of the most excluded groups, for example, youth and LGBTQIQ people. So we involve them in the evaluation process of our activities, and this for us ensures that their voices are at the center of assessing our advocacy efforts and their impact. So it's important for us because we are able to know whether the mechanisms and approaches that we used were truly accessible and effective from their perspective as the people who need them the most. But also, and especially from a very African feminist perspective, it's in collecting and analyzing the stories from women and girls about their experiences, and for them to be able to provide deep insights into the effectiveness of our advocacy. So it's not just storytelling in form of what you could read in a newspaper, but capturing the impact in a personal and human way that also highlights areas where these protection systems may be failing. Some of the challenges that we faced are that for protection advocacy, it faces significant resistance from political or cultural institutions that maintain patriarchal norms, and this sometimes undermines the effectiveness of our advocacy efforts and makes it difficult to capture or report on progress, particularly in contexts where there is a backlash or further marginalization of women's rights. So for this, some of the approaches we've used are to develop context-specific strategies that account for the political and cultural dynamics in the region. But we also engage local women's organizations and women themselves at the local level to navigate these challenges. But another challenge is that even when protection advocacy achieves its initial successes, for example, when a law is passed, sustaining these impacts over time has been challenging. And without continued advocacy and monitoring, some of the gains have been eroded. And this has weakened protection for women and girls. So what we are doing about that at this point is sort of like embedding sustainability mechanisms from the outset. And this could be including capacity building for local women's organizations to monitor and advocate for continued protection measures, even beyond the duration of a project, but also integrating protection advocacy in our broader peace building and development efforts, but also advocating for flexible and long-term funding that supports comprehensive protection advocacy efforts, including the development and application of feminist M&E frameworks. Because most times when we submit donor proposals and you include a provision for an M&E officer or an M&E person, it's one of the first things that they'll take out to focus on maybe communications, to focus on program manager and advocacy. But trying to get donors to understand the importance of M&E from a feminist perspective. And lastly, we also face a challenge in terms of the nature of advocacy, that sometimes the impact of our efforts takes years to manifest. Yeah, you could start advocating for a law right now that's passed about 5 years or 10 years later. So it's particularly problematic when donors or stakeholders expect quick results. So what we propose is that rather than focusing on long-term outcomes, that M&E processes or approaches could start incorporating process indicators which capture progress of advocacy activities that contribute towards the end goal. So they are not, or they may not be able to show immediate impact, but they are important towards achieving the long-term goals. But also we've had to sometimes break down long-term goals into smaller, more immediate milestones that can be tracked over shorter periods. And in situations where quantitative impact data is hard to obtain quickly, we use qualitative evidence such as the testimonies, case studies, and interviews that really provide the narratives of change. So I'll stop there for now, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pauline. That was really extraordinary. I think I used the word tremendous for Whipsy earlier, and that obviously applies here. I just want to say thanks for calling on us to think about power and transformation and the actual lived experiences of those that we seek to serve. A feminist approach to meal helps us look not only at what is impactful, but to whom it is impactful. And if we're not capturing impact for the most marginalized from their perspectives, we are not capturing impact. So thank you for making that so clear, Pauline. I'm going to hand over now to actually 3 colleagues, Bushra Khalidi, Hannah Klager, and Elizabeth White, who are presenting together from Oxfam, Crisis Action, and SAVE on the Ceasefire Now campaign They're going to be co-presenting on their experiences with a global campaign that goes across multiple partners. So over to you three to model how to work in partnership, even during presentations.
Thank you so much, Helena. And hi, everyone. I was wondering, Yasmin, if we could actually begin with the video, a short video, and then I'll jump in. Thanks so much.
Ceasefire now. Ceasefire now. Ceasefire now.
Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now!
Ceasefire now. Ceasefire now. Ceasefire now.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Klager. I work for an organization called Crisis Action, which you might not have heard of, but we are a catalyst and strategic convener for organizations working together to protect civilians in armed conflict. And in the beginning days of the war, we immediately convened partners, humanitarian, human rights partners, grassroots organizers, all sorts of partners, Palestinian, Israeli, bringing everyone together to immediately come together and have a discussion about how to organize ourselves and how to build a coalition. Out of that initial convening, which happened within days of the conflict starting, Save the Children and Oxfam approached Crisis Action, with the call that there needs to be a ceasefire. There needs to be a concerted, global, organized effort to call for a ceasefire. Mindful that in the beginning days of this war and weeks of this war, it was completely politically impossible to be doing so. And what does it mean for humanitarians to be leading this charge so early on in a space where it was incredibly difficult to do so? So we had the privilege of beginning to start to put together a dream team coalition of both humanitarian partners, but also human rights partners. And this was a smaller group in the beginning, around 15, to draft an initial joint NGO statement calling for a ceasefire. Why it's important and why we recognize that this was not a business as usual scenario, that the situation on the ground, the fluid nature of it, the complexity, the level of harm, the scale, the pace, was unprecedented. And it required innovation, it required experimentation, and it required a global unified coordinating body to help drive impact forward. And a unified vision of what that impact was that everyone would be calling for a ceasefire, and the longer term vision of looking at both the immediate and the longer term needs of what would be required to both protect civilians and address the humanitarian emergency on the ground. So this required looking beyond a traditional or centralized form of advocacy and creating what we call an opt-in model, an opt-in coalition model, where we bring together as many folks as possible, mindful of the variety of mandates of different missions that different partners have, but around the common call for a ceasefire, that this was a unifying call and it was a powerful one. And to have humanitarians stand side by side with Amnesty in the very beginning, where it was also breaking from their traditional mandate to call for a ceasefire. It was a very significant and symbolic move. And it was meaningful to have humanitarians standing alongside human rights groups calling for this. So after that initial statement was launched, it snowballed, and we now have over 900 organizations from over 100 countries who signed this call. And it was launched in parallel with a grassroots mobilization aspect, a petition through change.org and Avaz and other organizations. Oxfam, Amnesty put out individual petitions, but essentially around the same unifying call for a ceasefire that reached around 4 million, over 4 million signatures of individuals from around the world. So you have INGOs mobilizing together with grassroots groups with all different small, large organizations from around the world in parallel with people mobilization and mobilizing the public. And this is what really, the video that you just saw was a testament to the success of this. This was a global day of action calling for a ceasefire, where we packaged together a toolkit for both INGOs and everyday people to use to call for this and a day of action, where we were fearful that the spotlight would be waning on calls for ceasefire leading into the holiday season. So I don't want to take up too much time, but just to emphasize that catalyzing smart collective action and a unity of purpose was absolutely essential to driving the impact of the model that we've seen. And this model has now become more formalized, even though we still have an opt-in model, which means even if every organization can't use or sign on to every statement or can't say, you know, calling for arms, they're still included in the conversation. They're still being coordinated alongside the coalition. And that was very key, because the ceasefire now call over time evolved into a really unprecedented call for stop sending arms. And this has led us into sort of new territory and space where how unique it is to have so many humanitarians around the world, with over 250 signing on to a letter calling to stop sending arms, that it was no longer sufficient to call for a ceasefire, but that the protection links humanitarian aid obstruction conversation needed to be linked to accountability and calls to stop sending arms. And this would have never been possible, I think, without the coalition, the power of the coalition. And it created a safe space for organizations, both internally, to have hard conversations around mandates, around where their own positionings were on certain issues. And that safe space is a community that we hold very dear. And the advocacy measurements, and when we think about impact, was both internal as much as it was external, I would say. And in fact, I don't think as many organizations would be where they are now on messaging, on calling for halting arms, on calling for some of these issues that were historically seen as impossible to call for, had it not been for the momentum and the solidarity and the cover and safety net of this unbranded large global coalition calling for this. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to my colleague Bushra to take it forward with more concrete examples.
Thanks, Hannah. So I just kind of want to lean in a little more into what was the strategy around the call for the ceasefire and also the broader campaign. And Hannah touched upon it, you know, but with the immediate need for a ceasefire to protect civilians directly linked to the humanitarian needs in Gaza. But beyond that, it was also, you know, we were seeing the constant dehumanization of the Palestinian narrative in, you know, public discourse, and the predominant focus, especially in October, on, you know, Israel's right to self-defense. And therefore, you know, as humanitarians, we felt like we had a role to kind of counter that narrative, you know, of right to self-defense, but at what cost? And so we came together to build that counter narrative, focusing on the humanitarian crisis and the urgent need for the ceasefire as the starting point, but for broader peace and justice. And then, you know, and as Hannah explained, kind of snowballed into kind of, you know, this broader call for addressing the root causes as well, where we're, you know, calling for an end of the occupation, an end to the siege, and for accountability. There was also a big conversation on the public versus the private in the campaign. You know, we've been campaigning on Palestine, and I live in Ramallah, so you know, I've been doing this work for too long, as a Palestinian, but also as a humanitarian. And you know, the private advocacy space was so closed on Palestine. It was leading to no impact. It was leading to no change on the ground. In fact, like things were just getting worse. And so we also agreed as a campaign and as a coalition that the only way to really affect change was through the public and through our public campaigning. And that was, it really is the core and the ethos of the campaign as well, is, you know, we need to go together publicly, and be as loud as possible together. And that's, of course, helped us also mitigate a lot of risks. And especially in light of how private advocacy was not proven effective at all. Another kind of aspect or you know, hidden objective or silent objective of the campaign was debunking misinformation, because, you know, in times of war, there's, you know, propaganda machines on both sides, obviously, of the warring parties. So a key kind of objective for us was, you know, we want to debunk the use of humanitarian terms. So, for example, when Israel was calling for safe zones, we would organize, you know, media briefings that these are not safe zones. You know, safe zones are agreed to by the parties. These zones have not been agreed to by the parties, and us as humanitarians refuse to deliver in those, you know, Israeli designated zones. So that we had really, we were its core and not let it be appropriated by, I mean, mostly Israel, but by others and by other counterparts and other kind of actors. You know, and I think we've been very successful in countering this misinformation narrative. And then, I mean, and then just to close, and then I'll pass over to Elizabeth to talk a little bit about the importance of coordination. But I think what another objective was really the root causes. We've been doing, again, advocacy on Palestine for years. Addressing root causes has been part of, you know, our advocacy strategy, and objectives in our advocacy strategy jointly, all of us. So that had to also be somehow integrated. But the problem is that, you know, between calling for a ceasefire and addressing root causes, there's a space there where you need to bring the people calling for a ceasefire towards the addressing root causes. And I think like the call for arms was the perfect milestone to get there. And now that we're on the call for a halt to arms to Israel, we're seeing that has, you know, that no state has really taken real measures to stop arms transfers to Israel. And that gives us an opportunity to bring the coalition towards, you know, further kind of escalating the narrative and kind of the asks to third states together. But Elizabeth, I'll pass it on to you, and then I'll be coming back to speak a little more about meal and how we've done it for this campaign.
Thanks, Bushra, and hi everyone. I'm Elizabeth, the Advocacy Campaigns Comms and Media Director for Save the Children in Palestine. Wanted to just take a couple of minutes to talk about strategic coordination and links between different types of organisation. I think one of the things that's incredibly unique about this campaign, at least in my experience in other contexts as well, is the way that it plugs into the advocacy ecosystem in a way that breaks the traditional parameters for that for operational NGOs like Oxfam, like Save the Children. It's a space that is open to human rights actors, humanitarian, operational entities, organizations in different places that might not otherwise have a space in which to contribute to and put their names to kind of joint products. And we have flexed that into different places and worked with quite non-traditional actors for humanitarian operational NGOs to work with, like Artists for Ceasefire, for instance. So, you know, getting a bit more plugged in with the activists and the civic mobilization piece, as well as the human rights side and the humanitarian as well. So that's been a huge strength. And I think what that has given us from a strategy standpoint is this space of constant strategy development and evolution. It's almost inherent to the way we work and bringing everyone together, because there's a sufficient enough echo chamber in kind of the right ways, the call to action binds everyone together. But the insights into and perspectives on how to get there are very different depending on where different organizations and actors are sitting and their remits, their mandates, their thresholds, etc. So that's made the work much stronger, and it means everything is thoroughly sense checked and adapted to where it needs to be to maximize its strategic impact in different places. We've also been able to kind of, I know it's a bit of jargon to say like local to global, and there are challenges around this, which I'll come on to later, but you know, we've got people involved in this space and this coalition who have a seat on the humanitarian country team, who are, you know, plugged in at strategic advisory group level for different clusters, for example, who have strong UN relationships. But then you've also got people sat in key capitals who don't have that operational insight, and there's been a real a clear added value of the different sides of the house in that respect as well, making sure things are driven from the ground and based on those realities, but informed by and cognizant of those strategic considerations and opportunities elsewhere, in a way that, yeah, we haven't maximized to this extent, I think, before. I think another strength in terms of the coordination piece is it's such an open space, which has resulted in different functions as well from organizations. So we've got comms people there, we've got campaigners, we've got policy people, again, humanitarian policy versus, you know, more of your human rights side of the house as well. There's not too many organizations like Oxfam and SAVE that are dual mandate in that respect, humanitarian and human rights. So it's been great to have people from different functions in those spaces as well. And has helped us to translate kind of the advocacy asks into different appropriate formats and products. It's also been great at making the most of the different capacities and added values of different types of organization size-wise. So Save the Children and Oxfam, for instance, have quite big machinery behind them. So in some respects, we've got more capacity to offer to joint initiatives. On the other hand, there's a lot that's expected of us as individual organizations as well. So sometimes we don't have the same space to do that. While sometimes you have smaller organizations, they don't have that machinery, they're keen to get involved, but they can't kind of drive it alone as an organization. And I think the coalition has really given the opportunities for different types of organization to play those roles and add that value at different times. For instance, the access snapshots that we're putting out every fortnight, we have different drafters every time, a team of 2 or 3 from different organizations. And it's really varied between kind of the bigger ones and the smaller ones and combinations based on who's got capacity when. But that's been another real strength. And then the last thing I'd say on this is kind of a byproduct almost, and this speaks a bit to a point Hannah made. We've helped hold each other to account to strengthen our messaging appropriately in lockstep. There are steps we've been able to take in what we're saying that for Save the Children, at least, we wouldn't have been able to do that alone as quickly. And that kind of mobilization and collective pressure helped everyone jump together, like the arms transfer suspension call. But a byproduct of that is that we all have intimate awareness of each other's lines and positions in general now for kind of advocacy coordination purposes. So when an organization is looking to strengthen their position and make that case internally, we know who to go to, who's already done it with a similar risk profile to us, for instance, who can help add weight to that. And when we're doing joint products, we can preempt which organizations will have issues with which language and how to navigate. So it's just really strengthened the coordination and the collective shifts that are needed. I will pass back to Bushra now to speak to you about use of meal frameworks in our advocacy through Ceasefire Now.
Yeah, so since this is about meal, we can't talk only about our campaign and the successes of our campaign, but I'll come to that as well. And so, you know, of course, with such a complex and sensitive context, just Palestine, traditional meal frameworks as we know them, or in the way that some of you in the beginning had presented them, they fall short. And often we as well, we're not really well equipped or have the capacity to think creatively really about meal for advocacy, especially in the case of protracted crises. You know, for example, the number of condemnation by member states, you know, it's not necessarily an effective way in Palestine to measure impact, because that doesn't actually translate to anything on the ground. And as you know, advocacy work doesn't always produce immediate and quantifiable results, and its impact, as you were explaining earlier in the first presentation, it's not always so linear, and it's not so easily measured by like the standard indicators. And so meal, especially in this context, it needs to be kind of adapted to better capture the nuances and the evolving nature of advocacy efforts, such as, for example, you know, the Ceasefire Now campaign, where we've, for example, adopted a more flexible and reflective approach to meal. So one that really recognizes the unique challenges of advocacy work in such a highly politicized and protracted conflict. And instead of solely relying on the traditional metrics, we really focus on capturing incremental shifts in public discourse and policy changes, and the strengthening of global coalitions. And this approach really is more qualitative and interpretive, and we really emphasize the importance of narrative change, and alliance building. We're really up against a machine here that doesn't allow any progress whatsoever on the ground. And that's been the main challenge in capturing meal, right? Because in Gaza, every single day, it's worse, you know, in the last 10 months, nothing has gotten better. And we're just really at the brink, and now it's kind of spilling over into the West Bank. But for example, we look at the negotiations for humanitarian access and what's happening on that. And for example, the entry of fuel into Gaza, that was like a key, for example, success, even though it wasn't directly because of the campaigning, but that definitely contributed. We were talking a lot about entry of fuel because we couldn't carry out our humanitarian operations without fuel. And that was kind of the argument that we were making, always linking it back to humanitarian access and our operations on the ground. We also, for example, in terms of trying to capture impact, because we have such limited capacity and we're in reactive mode, we also funded as a coalition and outsourced 2 consultants to conduct an impact evaluation for us, with 2 consultants. And this really contributed to how we developed our strategy moving forward, and continues to do so. And so, for example, instead of setting predefined indicators, we've collected evidence from different stakeholders, external partners, people from the actual coalition. So we have a steering committee now. There's a formal structure to the coalition where we have a steering committee. We've hired a full-time campaign coordinator. And so, you know, we conducted, for example, one-to-one interviews with all of these people, but also others from like UN agencies, from UNRWA, to understand how the campaign may have contributed to some changes on the ground, and really allowed us to capture unexpected, for example, outcomes. We involved this diverse range of stakeholders, and it really helped us gain a deep understanding of the impact from different perspectives. And of course, to ensure that the voices of those most affected are always central to our learning. And often, unfortunately, you know, what Palestinians are saying is that nothing is working, nothing is enough. It's like we've tried everything and nothing's really giving. But at the same time, if we look kind of internally into the campaign, I mean, what we have built over the last 10 months, that's never, ever, ever happened in the history of advocacy around Palestine. One last point, I think by adopting this more kind of fluid and adaptive approach, we're able to like better track maybe some progress. And this is super important in situations like Palestine, because advocacy is not only about immediate outcomes here, and it's really about shifting the longer term narratives and really creating sustainable change. And so, you know, for us, it's really about the longer term advocacy piece that's been done, for example, by Palestinian rights groups for years. And so what's happened in terms of this widespread global solidarity movement, that's not just occurred in a vacuum because a bunch of humanitarians called for a ceasefire. We definitely contributed, but these are also efforts that are grounded in efforts from Palestinian civil society that has been laying down the groundwork for years, calling for a free Palestine and an end to the Israeli military occupation and siege. I just want to share a few key kind of achievements from our evaluation, from the actual evaluation, the report. And, you know, if some of you are interested, we can share this. It's an internal document, so please, it's not for wide sharing, but we're happy to share it with a couple people just to see how we've done this evaluation. We normalize the call for a ceasefire, and we normalize the halt to arms transfer with the help, of course, of the grassroots solidarity movement. But really, we think that the campaign contributed to significant shift in at least policymakers level in the Western public sphere, normalizing this call for a ceasefire, where, you know, I think one of the funniest moments of the campaign is when we saw Justin Trudeau, you know, trip up on saying, and then he said, cease the violence in the, you know, in Gaza, because ceasefire became just this highly politicized, you know, term. I mean, Hannah says it, over 900 organizations, over 100 countries calling for a ceasefire. I mean, unprecedented, really. And we think that the campaign really played a role in shifting positions in France and Canada on ceasefire and arms, and also influencing resolutions in the UNGA, in the United Nations General Assembly. You know, also contributing to, for example, temporary reopening of key crossings for humanitarian aid, the entry of fuel, like I said. And we have this, you know, like as Elizabeth said, because we have this direct line to the country teams and to the operational teams, we were really able to bring things quickly to the table. And finally, you know, the campaign's role really was successful also in supporting accountability mechanisms. The campaign was directly quoted in the ICJ opinion of the South African case. You know, and so that's also part of our silent objectives, where we want the prevention of genocide happen, you know, in potential plausible genocide happening in Gaza. We want, you know, war crimes to be prosecuted, and we want to contribute to these cases in judicial and non-judicial kind of accountability mechanism. And I think we're getting there, and and these snapshots that we're doing also contribute to this work. And Elizabeth will kind of finish off, and we're almost finished. I'm sorry.
Thanks. Real quick, Elizabeth, so that we can do a little bit of Q&A. Thanks.
Absolutely. Just a couple of points on challenges and lessons learned. Of course, a lot of the work is inherently reactive. It is a context that is developing in a way that kind of forces us into that position a lot of the time. So challenging to proactively plan. I think that's a challenge for all the organizations, and then collectively, of course, the added layers of coordination. Things around agreeing messaging have at times posed challenges, particularly around the root causes of the conflict. We have actors who've never advocated on Palestine before joining this coalition. So their starting point is in a very different place to those who've been here a long time, who've got comfortable with talking about the occupation and the history out of which the situation has arisen. So that has been something that has posed a challenge. And then a really big one, we are still not satisfied with the way that we work with Palestinian organizations. It's still ad hoc, it's still piecemeal. We know that often we cannot agree messaging with Palestinian organizations, and some of those with a lower risk threshold on the international side, but that's okay. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be coordinating our respective messaging and pushes. And there is, of course, a risk that in continuing to use the platform we have and leave Palestinian organizations out of that space, we can inadvertently entrench the disenfranchisement of Palestinian voices, essentially a weapon that's been used in the occupation for decades, that tries to discredit their voices. There's a risk that we can inadvertently perpetuate that by not using our platform and lending our platform to those voices who, of course, have the most credibility given their lived experience, leadership. So this is something that we are trying to tackle individually as organizations and as a collective. Last thing I would say is just on the risk side. Of course, the risk thresholds and appetites are different if you're operational, if you're human rights but outside the country, etc. So that also plays a role in making agreement at times on messaging challenging, but these are the things that are inherent to coalition work, and they can be navigated for the greater good, and that's what we've tried to do.
Thanks so much,
I'll stop
Elizabeth.
there.
And thanks so much for everyone else from Ceasefire Now. I think it's been very important that you were able to bring up kind of what advocacy can do, even in the most challenging of circumstances, and that we can and do see impact and results, and that we can track that impact and results, even if we're looking at slightly different, non-traditional ways to do that. We recognize that folks have to start to drift off, especially when we get into the next hour. And so we did want to give people the opportunity, it is a meal webinar, to give their feedback on the webinar and also what we might want to do in the future. So we have just 2 more questions for you, after which we'll go into a Q&A. So please don't leave yet, because we do want to hear your questions and your reflections. But we'll give you the opportunity to answer this poll. While we do that, I'm actually going to see if Yasmin, who has been our dedicated colleague in the background here, would like to come in with any of her learnings or reflections at this point too.
Thank you very much, Lena, and thank you very much to all our speakers. I think the interventions really brought something to the discussion. Protection is somehow always accused by meal people to be very vague. Advocacy, the same. Put them together, protection, advocacy, it's like a nightmare for traditional meal. So this has already been a very big challenge for protection advocacy on how to capture the impact, and it was on purpose to talk about capturing the impact rather than meal, because it goes beyond the traditional ways of capturing impact to a more revolutionary way that we have seen in the different interventions of our colleagues. Maybe just few thoughts that also reflect very much what has been covered in the interventions. We need to start speaking of a feminist, decolonized, anti-colonial way of capturing impact. If that means dropping even the meal terminology, maybe why not we could do that. It's just also another advocacy process that we need to lead on. We need something that doesn't reduce people to numbers, to capture experiences and stories. And when we talk about impact, I think Pauline mentioned this, is like impact for who? Even like when we are talking about impact, it goes to not one category, but look at the intersectionality. What are the different things that play into what we call impact, and when? We need a lot of flexibility. This is something that in the first intervention of Claire was covered, that we need to change maybe throughout the process. But one more thing that we need also is to give ownership to the people of the process of measuring the impact on themselves and their experiences. We tend to put indicators that mean nothing to the people. So also, how are we going to give ownership of these processes to the people? This is a big discussion. It doesn't come easily because it also requires a little bit of resources at the beginning, but we need to start investing in that direction. So giving ownership to the people on the process. Storytelling was mentioned, and it's a great way of doing it. And it could become, you know, sometimes when we say storytelling, people think of like a bedtime story. It's not about this, but it's really to hear the perspective and capture the experience of the people from their perspective. And mainly we need a new approach, we need new tools, we need a new lens of doing things. And maybe I will call on all the international actors on the call to take the responsibility a bit of doing that. I think Elizabeth mentioned that it cannot be the national actors doing that on their own and challenging the system on their own. So maybe this is also a call on the ways forward, that we come together and maybe propose something rather than just see what are the problems, but come up with new tools and a new approach that we could also push with the donors. And I'm sure that the GPC would be more than happy to support that. I know our colleagues are on the call, and I'm sure that they will be happy to support also this revolution.
Thanks so much, Yasmin. I love all the revolutionary feminist calls coming up through here. I don't personally always think of meal as revolutionary, but we obviously can use it to be revolutionary and thinking not just about what we capture in terms of impact, but for who impact is happening. So we do have about 10 minutes or so for a Q&A. If you want to raise your hands, I will call on folks until I see hands start going up. I do have one question that I might take some moderator privilege to ask, because I feel like we've kind of skirted around one of the core issues or challenges with meal, but I'd love for us to try to take it head on and be real, that a lot of the indicators that we capture are about what donors want, which is not particularly revolutionary. And I think sometimes for advocacy specifically is not particularly useful. So to panelists or others, if you have answers, have you seen a way for donors to actually be helpful in this space and help us not, I think Yasmin put it, reduce people to numbers? Are there any good practices that we can elevate for donors? And this is to everyone. I know that Claire did mention working with donors, but I think others probably have experience too. So over to the panel.
I mean, I can answer a bit on that, Elena. If you take a donor like CEDA, they supported quite a revolutionary evaluation a while back. I think it was in Bangladesh. And this was a long time ago, where they just allowed the community to determine what the indicators should be. So it was very early stage local ownership and participation, but it was still fairly quantitative. It was still about counting improvements. But if you look at the work around most significant change or outcome harvesting, then it is quite a lot more. Is not predetermined, so it can't be selected by the donor. It emerges during the course. You don't kind of have indicators in that way. So if you can persuade your donor to move to an evaluation methodology like that, the whole question goes away. Yeah, so maybe that will help.
Felicity, not to put you on the spot, but I did see your comment in the chat, basically using donors as advocates. So I did want to give you a chance if you'd love to come in and give more details on that. We'd be happy to hear them.
Hi everyone. Sorry, I'm off camera. It's a no makeup day today. Thank you so much for the presentations. This is something that we're really thinking really carefully about at the moment, and it's been really insightful to hear from others' experiences. And as a partner on the ceasefire campaign, just fully agree with a lot of those observations, and grateful to have been part of that. In terms of our donor allies, Claire mentioned CEDA. I think they are definitely one of them that has been more open from the outset in experimenting with some new ways of doing meal for advocacy as well. And as many of you will know, they also convened a kind of like-minded donors group that in which other kind of officials from other governments come together and hear from them. So that's one mechanism through which we've noticed a difference in terms of how protection is understood in general. So not just for advocacy, but how civilian protection is conceived by donors, but then broader than that. Yeah, more than one CEDA. And so Swedish CEDA convenes the kind of like-minded donors group, and that's been a really useful vehicle for us and for others working in this space. And then for us, I mean, the Dutch government have just been incredible allies, really open to experimentation and adaptive models. And we're working on a really exciting project around policy influencing with them now. Those relationships can take some time to build, but I think once you find the people that really understand the kinds of things that we're getting at in these calls, we've found a high level of willingness to then step up and be advocates as well with other donors, which, you know, can often be more effective than our organizations trying to go at it alone. So, you know, donors, as much as we can struggle with them sometimes, I think when you find the right allies, can also be very useful at advancing these goals.
Thanks so much, Felicity. I think you're right. Not only do donors like talking to other donors, but sometimes they're more comfortable with the ideas coming from other donors, even if they originate with us. I saw a question in the chat from Jerome that I'm going to read out for the purposes of the interpreters. Jerome from Asia Displacement Solutions Platform asked, do you have any suggestions to measure impact and generate learning from advocacy on a long-term perspective? Often MEAL is embedded within relatively short or medium-term projects, but aiming to measure long-term impact, which in itself is quite a challenge and is quite unrealistic or unpractical. Do we have any suggestions or methodologies or tools for that? Thank you.
I mean, it's a really good point, Jeremy. I mean, we've done one 10-year look back at, that was a strategic litigation work, so it wasn't protection advocacy, but I think it's quite comparable. So donors will sometimes give you money to look back over 10 years and say what's changed. And clearly you need to look beyond the 2 or 3 year program cycle. But I think it hints at two other things. I mean, Pauline did talk about timing and how difficult timing is, and that you may see very, very little progress, and talking about tipping points, you know, that you may see that nothing is happening, and then suddenly things can flip. And do you know if you're on that journey or if you're just banging your head against a brick wall, and how do you know, which is quite challenging. But the other thing I just wanted to mention, sorry, while I've got the mic, is counterfactuals. So that sparked the ceasefire campaign sparked that. So in a situation where things are getting worse, the fact that things are not getting worse faster, or they're getting worse a little bit slower, or with more communication about the fact they're getting worse, may actually be a positive. And I think in a context where you're facing kind of really intractable obstacles and very, very, very stuck situations, you have to look at what the situation would have been if you hadn't acted, and argue that what you've achieved is to prevent it getting even worse. But then that starts to get quite complicated, because how do you prove what would have happened without your intervention? So, but I mean, you can make plausible cases about these things, and you can get experts to say, yes, it was heading in that direction, and these guys came along and they made the conversation change. So it can be done, but be bold, be creative.
Thanks so much, Claire. Noting that we only have 3 minutes left, I'm actually going to wrap us up here and say thank you very much to all of our speakers and all of the participants for your questions and your conversation. You'll note that a couple of more resources were put in the chat, and we hope that you'll look those over and that this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end. If you didn't get a chance to answer the poll, please reach out and let us know what else we need to cover from this type of webinar so that we can make this into a series and have these kinds of conversations as we tackle shared challenges. And while Claire brought up some counterfactuals, I'm going to mention a few of the truths that I heard today. First was advocacy does have an impact, and it has an impact even in humanitarian settings. But meal can capture that impact, again, even in humanitarian settings, and even about protection concerns. And that we do have a lot of tools to capture that impact, even if those tools don't look at the same things that other meal efforts might look like. And the last thing that I heard is that we shouldn't be afraid to push back on the more traditional ways that we do meal, that we shouldn't be afraid to push back on donors, but in fact, use donors, work with donors as advocates, so that meal for advocacy can be done in those different and unique ways. And that we heard a very strong call to concentrate our meal on the impacts on those that we seek to serve. We can look at the root causes, we can look at power dynamics, and we should look at those things because it's at least as important to think of what we did as it is to think about for whom was our work impactful. So I'll wrap us up there, but please do keep the conversation going. Thank you again to all of the panelists. And I'll just end by saying, please stay safe, stay hydrated, and bye.
Thank you very much, Philip and Claudia. I'm going to end the call now. Thank you.